Every era has its new diseases. AIDS is not the first and won't be the last. Our history and destiny are shaped by our diseases. The origins of our ills are complex, mysterious, and surprising. And they must be understood if we are to avoid always being plagued. Most of our diseases for ourselves through the way we live. Once released, these diseases have then become silent soldiers in history. Powerful forces which have in large part dictated the human map of the world today. It's a fascinating interwoven story involving greed, our immunity, and our vulnerability to these diseases, to these invisible armies.
Hi, this is Lisa from Lisa and Culture. Measles, it isn't just one of those kids' diseases. It's serious.
Measles can make your child blind or retarded. It can lead to pneumonia, swelling of the brain, or even death. Right now, measles is infecting hundreds of
Measles is one of the diseases which help draw the map of the world. It kills children in vast numbers in developing countries. But it's a disease which still threatens we who live in so-called advanced nations. Despite immunization, measles is on its way back in cities like Los Angeles because it's so easy to overwhelm the fragile protection of medicine.
People forget how serious a disease measles is. Measles lasts about 10 days, and it's associated with very significant symptoms: high fever, severe cough, severe runny nose, and red and painful eyes. And that's just the routine case of measles. We saw in the peak 6 months of the epidemic last year, from January through June, we saw 440 cases of measles here at Children's Hospital alone. And about 40% of those children, 45% of those children were admitted to hospital. 3 of them died due to pulmonary complications, lung complications, the infection. I'm angry because the illnesses that we are concerned about today, that we're talking about, are entirely preventable. We don't have to see the numbers of cases of measles and tuberculosis that we're seeing.
That's good. The first one. Yeah, sometimes not. Okay. Can you please hold his leg?
Measles is preventable by a simple injection.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This one. I'm sorry. Don't forget to apply 1,000.
But relatively few Hispanic children are being immunized. The health workers in this clinic are going around trying to find who hasn't had their shots and convince parents to have their children injected on the spot. The mothers haven't had it done till now because they can't afford health care. The free clinics are far from where they live. They're scared of being caught as illegal migrants. The measles epidemic in LA is a warning that poverty and alienation can knock away the foundations of community health.
Measles is, as you would say, waving a red flag, some kind of signal to say, look at everyone, I'm the first one, I'm the most contagious. When vaccination levels fall this much, I'm going to be popping my head out and children are going to start getting measles. If you let it fall any further, children are going to be having diphtheria, pertussis. Last year, we already had a rubella epidemic, which is also very contagious, and you need high levels in order to have herd immunity. So it definitely, it's much more than there was a measles epidemic. There was an immunization crisis, failure to get children vaccinated over a period of probably the last 3 to 5 years. And that's just the very first warning signal that if we don't do something now, we're going to have a lot bigger problems on our hands, like another epidemic of diphtheria or whooping cough.
What's the next epidemic we're going to see? Are we going to see an outbreak of polio? Are we going to start seeing tetanus or diphtheria occurring in these populations? We already are seeing tuberculosis increasing in incidence in many cities across the United States.
So when the defenses of an advanced nation fail, the old diseases recur. And not just in the poor. Problems with immunization are also showing up amongst white, affluent Americans. And it's an irony, since measles is one of the diseases which made America white. Measles was part of an invisible army. It was a terrible army drafted out of human history. In addition to measles, there were diseases like yellow fever, malaria, and smallpox.
I'm sorry.
In our sanitized Western world, we've forgotten what an infection such as smallpox looked like. This is a story of conquest, where the conqueror's silent weapons were the diseases they inflicted on others. And to understand the origins of these diseases, in fact of these invisible armies, we have to go back to where human existence began, to Africa. The dawn of humankind was in the African savanna, near the forests where we'd evolved. Africa has also been where many diseases began. Our ancestors, 50,000 years ago, were more part of the natural environment than they would ever be again. Living in small groups, people survived by hunting and gathering, and were well-nourished, tall and fit. There weren't enough humans around then for there to be exclusively human diseases. The great store of infections lay in the animals and insects around them. They suffered from parasites in the raw meat they ate. And there was malaria, one of the most ancient of our ills, which started in forest primates and was transmitted from person to person by mosquitoes. Humans multiplied. They moved on to new lands. Europe and Asia had different animals and insects, so people walked into new diseases and left some of the old ones behind. About 12,000 years ago, during an ice age, intrepid and no doubt cold hunter-gatherers crossed a land bridge into what's now Alaska, and they entered a virgin continent which was remarkably disease-free. Soon the ice retreated, and America was isolated again. Around 8,000 years ago, new deserts formed. What had been woodland became the Sahara, putting up a barrier to tropical Africa. Then we fundamentally changed the way we lived. In the well-watered valleys of the Fertile Crescent, the Nile and the Indus, farming began. Farming was to have an enormous impact on human diseases. The hunters and gatherers domesticated animals. Then they settled and began planting domesticated grasses like wheat and rice. This was the beginning of great civilizations like Egypt and Sumeria. People settled in larger numbers than ever before. They lived in cramped contact with animals, and the herd and human germs flowed backwards and forwards with an unprecedented intensity. Measles and smallpox evolved from animal infections, like distemper and monkeypox, and became infections which only existed in humans. Smallpox and measles were crowd diseases because they needed plenty of human fuel to survive. So 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, in the desperately unhealthy cities of the Near East, people would have experienced measles as a new epidemic. Everywhere there was livestock, markets, slaughterhouses, tanneries, an environment full of living and dead animals, a paradise for germs. These cities were dangerous places, sumps for humankind. Innocent people who were virgin to the crowd diseases migrated from the countryside only to perish in the maelstrom of infection. But some parts of the world never had the crowds to sustain the crowd diseases. In Iceland, the terrifying experience of a sudden epidemic in a virgin population is within living memory.
In the time of my grandparents, measles were a very dangerous illness. It didn't happen often, in every 50 years. It was a disaster to the people at the time. It even wiped out the whole family.
This is how one epidemic began in 1904, in this little church. They were having a young girl's confirmation ceremony here. A dozen local families were at church that day. A Norwegian whaling ship had arrived, carrying a sailor with measles. The Icelanders, knowing what measles could do to them, quarantined the boat. But it didn't work. Someone who'd come in contact with the ship was here. He was developing measles and must have sneezed. It doesn't take much. And about 2 weeks later, in each of those families' homes, the sickness and deaths began. Measles spread to the tiny main town, where the local doctor said it was easier to count those who escaped the disease than count those who were affected by it. 40% of the population caught the infection and 23 people died. Every family was affected. Since there were so few people on the island, the measles epidemic would have infected everyone and exhausted itself within a year or two. But because of Iceland's isolation from frequent measles infection, a new virgin population developed. In a more crowded place, children would have had the opportunity to get mild disease, giving them a lifelong immunity. But in Iceland, that couldn't happen. The new generation would grow up, perhaps even to middle age, susceptible to measles, only then to be knocked down by the next measles virus to escape from a ship. An epidemic among such vulnerable people was inevitably severe. The experience of Icelanders earlier this century, on a small scale, is what the peoples of North America suffered terribly 500 years ago. If Christopher Columbus had seen a disease map of the world when he sailed, this is what it would have looked like. In Africa, there were the Old World infections like malaria and yellow fever. In Europe and the Middle East, there were the crowd diseases like measles and smallpox. And in the Americas, there was a virgin population.
One of the things that they've left or traded with us was a plague which started from up in northern Maine and swept down through this region here, decimating 80 to 85% of my people here. And of course, most of the people, they was dying so fast that my people escaped inland.
Before first contact with Europeans, North America was heavily populated with many indigenous nations.
Does anybody have any questions? I'll help them.
The first Americans had no idea they were to face a race whose immune systems had been armor-plated by 2,000 years of crowd diseases. The Europeans' disease history made them dangerous enemies of Native Americans. Prior to Columbus, there was a rich civilization in what's now the United States. This was a city of 14,000 people who built ceremonial mounds which were some of the largest structures in the world at that time. The first recorded European expedition into North America was led by a Spaniard in search of new lands. He was Hernando de Soto and went from Florida to Louisiana. It was a 3-year journey. He died before it ended. Amongst the Coosa tribe at Itaba, De Soto became one of the last outside people to witness this Native American culture. The last because of the silent soldiers which had gone with him.
In 1540, when the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto visited here, there would have been people sitting around the edges of this plaza, gossiping, talking, playing games. Children would have been running about, and all of the social hubbub of the society took place right here. They remained here for about a month. They rested up, they fed their horses, they commandeered food. They forced the Coosa to give them women and servants to take along with them. And then when De Soto departed from here, he took the chief of Coosa hostage. After De Soto departed, a curtain of darkness fell across the southeast, a historical darkness in which no Europeans of any note penetrated the southeast again until the late 1600s. When these colonists penetrated the interior, it did not look the way it looked when De Soto was here. There were far fewer people. There were tiny settlements of people. The big mound centers had been abandoned, and entire areas that had been populated by people when De Soto was here were a wilderness. The only reasonable explanation is that it was European diseases, old world diseases, which came in from the coast. I really believe that this is when the germs and viruses really began to penetrate in a big way.
After a century or two, not only had the culture been destroyed, the tribes had no memories of what life had been like before the white men arrived. When Europeans wondered who'd built the mounds, the descendants of the mound builders didn't know.
It was a tragedy. If De Soto hadn't brought the people in and the disturbance and the diseases, someone else would. It's a consequence of the reuniting of our species. It's reuniting the distance and the time between the separation of our species in the old world.
This is a meticulous reconstruction of Plymouth, the Pilgrim Fathers' village in 1627, only 7 years after the Mayflower landed. The houses are built exactly the way they were. The garden plots are laid out as they would have been. And the staff give a good insight into the minds of the people who arrived with the armour-plated immune systems.
You've heard of that ship called Mayflower, really? Yeah. Then a year later, there was a ship called Fortune. Have you ever heard of that ship?
What's that?
Is that what the rifle is for?
Musket, aye, to some degree, killing of wolves and shooting at birds and such like that.
He says he'd much rather journey overland some 20 years. What might take but a few days at sea, so vexing was it unto him.
And your name?
I am William Bradford, Master Bradford. Yes. I think truly God in his infinite wisdom would endeavour to smite the Indians with a grievous disease, kill them in large numbers as a means of preparing the place for our coming. I think there can be no doubt upon it.
We would see the Indians, but they would not have converse with us. They'd run off into the forest. It was some months before an Indian first came to us, a man called Samoset, who very odd, for he came into the town very boldly, said, "Greetings, English," and asked for some beer. Others odd that he hadn't knowledge of our tongue, yet the provenance of God. He told us that we are settled upon the remains of an Indian town called Patuxet. This was completely destroyed by a plague that swept south from the coast of Maine, some 3 to 4 years before our arrival. His people were reduced from at one time, by their own reckoning, of 5,000 or 6,000 down to less than 100 at one time.
What's our interpretation of the plague?
Plague, sir, is a great mystery of God.
Their tongue, their manner of dress and painting themselves is not wearing much better than animals. And, well, you can see the wildness of this place. They do not civilize the land. They do not tame it and so much as they run unruly in it. And so they must needs be civilized.
But European germs had a helping hand from appalling cruelty. For the Cherokees, few events were worse than the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees were a great nation with vast lands. But in 1838, they were forced from their homes to make way for white settlement. It was a bitter winter, and men, women, and children were seized and forced to march to Oklahoma. It's reckoned that 4,000 died. But unlike the mound builders, these memories are not forgotten.
Now, this is a picture of my great-great-grandmother. This woman came over during the Trail of Tears as a young girl. Her and her sister came over together. She was with her mother at that time, rounded up by the soldiers. Her mother wouldn't cross one of the rivers that they were supposed to cross, and she was shot, according to the story in our family. And so some other people took this little girl and her sister in and came over and made the journey with them. The ordeal was horrendous. There's just report after report after report of cholera, of whooping cough. A lot of children died from whooping cough, various other diseases that devastated the Cherokee population during this period. The problem for the Indians is that they were faced not only with an onslaught of disease, but they were faced with all sorts of things that simply didn't allow normal recovery mechanisms to operate. You know, left to their own devices, the Indians, as other people have, could have survived. But they simply weren't left to their own devices. They simply weren't left alone. Their societies were altered and changed in fundamental ways, and they could never be the same again.
Hawaii. Today these islands have the image of a tourist paradise. But that's built on a tragedy caused in part by colonization through disease. When Captain Cook landed here, he, like the Spanish in North America, found people who were healthy and well-nourished. In this case, though, the diseases of conquest were more than measles or smallpox. In Hawaii, syphilis and gonorrhea were the seeds of destruction. And tragically, the Hawaiians' own culture worked against them.
In 1777, you could not get more remote than this island was. 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, and the native Hawaiians were not just 2,000 miles, they were thousands of miles and thousands of years from their last continental contact, and hundreds of years and hundreds of miles from the last islands where they had lived. Then came 1778, and Captain Cook arrived, and that is not simply some ships with a few hundred Englishmen on board. That's to say that Eurasia arrived, the whole old world arrived, with its technology and religion and administrative practices, etc., and its diseases. Probably the most important thing that hit the Hawaiians was simply venereal disease, and the Hawaiians probably had either no important venereal diseases before the Europeans arrived. So they had a culture which included sexual hospitality, which I think is very common among the cultures of the world until a given culture gets a very nasty venereal disease, and then you get very strict about these things. So you have these men from the other side of the world who haven't seen women in months. They have no conception of Hawaiian culture, or of any culture but their own. and a lot of women who want to have sex with them. And surprisingly enough, these two groups managed to find each other. The Europeans, of course, completely misunderstood what was going on. They just thought it was some sort of wild, extravagant prostitution. And of course, the Hawaiians didn't know what was going on. The birth rate drops because venereal disease not only simply kills people, it more often than that, it ruins the ability of women to conceive. And I cannot myself, I'm lucky enough to be able to say I cannot conceive of what life must have been for these women with a shattered culture, with a few fragments of their culture left which told them to do exactly the wrong thing. When you look at the numbers, it's appalling, but when you think of what these people went through in that 100 years with their culture not destroyed but shattered, certainly, they couldn't manage the minimum requirement, which is simply to replace yourself on this earth. Their experience in the first 100 years after the arrival of Captain Cook is sometimes referred to simply as the horror, and I think that's a pretty good title. The Hawaiians went through an experience which is not really totally different from the experiences all our ancestors went through. Our ancestors took thousands of years to go through it. The Hawaiians, it was an avalanche. It happened in a very short period of time. It's repeated in many of the Pacific Islands. It's repeated 10,000 times over in the Americas, among the American Indians. It's what happens when the technologically advanced mass populations overtake the populations who walked out of Africa and Eurasia thousands and thousands of years ago.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. I still have a dream this afternoon. One day, inferior segregated schools will become a thing of a dark past. I still have a dream this afternoon.
The anger and frustration of American blacks, which led Martin Luther King into his tragic fight for civil rights, was what led to the 60s race riots when US cities burned. Today, that bitterness is seen in city slums from Los Angeles to London. It's a communal black pain which has festered on the memories of the 11 or 12 million people who were uprooted and the 5 million or more who died in the terrible dark days of slavery.
Any discussion of the slave trade and of slavery must be conditioned by the premise that none of us can really understand the enormity of what it must have meant to be human property. And none of us should ever conclude that slaves as persons had Teflon-like personalities so they could walk away from that experience unaffected. What we really are unable to understand fully are the psychological dimensions of being chattel.
And this story of slavery is inextricably bound up with our story of disease and history. It goes back to when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean. That was the first time the disease pools of the Old World met the virgin peoples of the Americas. The West Indies seemed so lush to the Spaniards. They could grow profitable crops like sugar. But the indigenous peoples didn't survive the disease onslaught from the European fleets. It's easy to imagine that the West Indies have always been black, but they haven't. The Spanish needed new labor to exploit their lands, so the colonialists looked for other sources of workers. But the only supply of laborers with tougher immune systems than the indigenous peoples was in Africa. But in going there for slaves, the Europeans were to unleash infectious forces they couldn't control. West African slaves went through an unprecedented process of fitness selection. In their distant homelands, the youngest and fittest would have been captured and taken to holding compounds to await the slave traders.
The old view of the slave trade used to be that ships simply sailed up to the coast and grabbed people, and this was associated with the belief that Africa was a savage and primitive place. In fact, the African societies were well organized, and African commerce was a developed commerce even before the Europeans turned up. So that what happened is that the Europeans attached themselves to existing commercial patterns and were able to buy slaves fed down to the coast in very large numbers. If you keep in mind the scale of this, it contradicts to some extent the old belief that Africa was a primitive and savage place. The Africans may not have been any more morally upright than the Europeans were, but they did in peak years in the 18th century deliver 100,000 people to the coast for sale to Europeans. That is a lot of people, and that requires a very sophisticated commercial network.
The slaves came to the ports from all over, from dry areas and from wet areas. And so most of the diseases of Africa got funneled down to the coast.
The forts, or the coastal area, represented a marketplace of disease. So it's an unholy exchange, so to speak, that reflected the varieties of disease environments on the coast and in the interior. This awful kind of thing continued during the crossing, where slaves tended to die from a variety of diseases, smallpox, the measles, dysentery, a variety of other kinds of ailments as well. And the members of the crew are dying from the same kinds of diseases that tormented the slaves. Crews were people who had been born in temperate latitudes in Northern Europe, let's say England or France. And when they went to the tropics, they lacked immunities against the tropical pathogens that they encountered there, principally fevers, blackwater fever, malaria, yellow fever, and so on. And so they would succumb to these tropical diseases, to which the Africans had a limited degree of immunity.
These diseases that killed Europeans in West Africa were then carried across the Atlantic by the slaves, and so that the tropical Americas came to be almost as dangerous as the tropical Africa was.
There was a constant need for new slaves because of enormous death rates. There was also a constant need for new European overseers, since the trade had transformed the Caribbean into a white man's grave. All of a sudden, the Europeans weren't such great colonizers anymore. They'd been confronted with people whose immune systems went back to the dawn of humankind. If you add imported African malaria and yellow fever, the European diseases like measles and smallpox, and awful sadism, then a sugar plantation became a pretty toxic place for everyone. A place where the population could never sustain itself.
We do have a lot of information about life on the Jamaican plantation, particularly the extensive diaries of Thomas Thistlewood, who ran one such estate, and in general, it was really an atrocious form of existence. Death was everywhere, disease was always present, and it was a very, very hard life.
In this setting, floggings were a commonplace on the estate for the very simple offenses of malingering, for example, brutal floggings, 100 lashes administered by himself. For running away, it was not only a combination of very severe beatings before the other slaves, but often urinating and defecating in the mouth of the slaves when they're tied to the ground. He was incapable of producing on his estate young children who reach maturity. There's an abnormally high death rate. In the estate records are cases of venereal diseases which are rampant. Thistlewood infected most of his slaves because he had this habit of sleeping indiscriminately with every female over the age of about 14. And he continued to sleep with slaves even after he had arranged their marriages with slaves he owned. It is very hard to know exactly from the records what slaves thought or did not think. But what is quite clear from some of the evidence we have and from survivors of slavery is that women in particular who were brutalized by white men, who because they were slaves were abused sexually, felt that the one area in which they could get back at the white man was not taking his offspring into the world. And there are a number of cases where women deliberately attempted to commit suicide or poisoned their offspring. So that this is an indication of their reaction to the system of slavery, that while they had to endure it where they could, they would not perpetuate it.
And we have to say that the slave trade will forever remain a shame, an awful shame, on those who involved themselves in it, on those who engaged in it. And when you look at the mortality rates, which could have been as high in some cases as 40% or 50%, then the horror becomes magnified. But the other dimension of the trade, of course, is that it does demonstrate to some extent the resilience and the triumph of the human spirit. Because many of these individuals who underwent that process walked away from it, not necessarily unscathed. I don't think anyone could have emerged unscathed. But many of these individuals were not vanquished and walked away as persons with their personhood, with their dignity, with their sense of self intact.
Who are now their own masters are built on the terrible experience of slavery. It is a triumph of the human spirit, but it's also a triumph of the black genes which were molded in Africa. Europeans simply didn't have the genes to resist diseases like malaria. And to be successful colonizers, they had to resort to drugs and even botanical espionage.
Kew Gardens was one of the most important factors in the development of the British Empire. Explorers, botanists, gardeners from Kew traveled throughout the world looking for plants which might be useful in developing colonies.
When the British went to North America, there's no question they were the conquerors. But when they went to Africa, they were the ones knocked over by the germs. The greed of the English was being held up by inconvenient tropical illnesses. And what their colonial aspirations needed was some good medicine.
This is a cinchona tree growing here at Kew. It enabled Europeans to colonize and rule parts of the world that had been closed to them before because of malaria.
Originally, the cinchona tree was only found in the Andes. The indigenous peoples of that part of South America had found that when they boiled the cinchona bark, the juice helped some fevers. The bark actually contained quinine, an effective treatment for malaria. The Spanish who ruled the area controlled the quinine market and jealously guarded their rare and highly profitable product. In 1858, the British sent an expedition to get the trees. One of its members was Robert Cross, a gardener at Kew. Cross went off by himself with these glass cases and managed to steal 657 cinchona cuttings.
Now this is one of the actual Wardian cases which we used in those days for transporting plants. And it was in many miniature greenhouses like this that Cross brought his living cinchona seedlings down from the uplands of Ecuador on mules at first, and then on a balsa raft down rapids and whirlpools to the coast, and eventually put them on ship for England and Kew.
At Kew, they propagated the seedlings, and cuttings were sent out across the British Empire. Very soon, huge plantations were established from Jamaica to India to mass-produce the bark. Within 20 years, by about 1880, all this cinchona bark was providing European soldiers with cheap, plentiful quinine, which allowed them to go into areas where they had previously feared to tread. Before 1880, there were actually very few decent-sized white settlements in Africa. But by 1910, that had changed dramatically, as European nations sent in their people armed with the now affordable quinine. So almost for the first time, the colonizers didn't have to rely on their own immunity. A drug could defend them against the invisible armies of others. The last episode of this clash of ancient disease pools is taking place right now. The Yanomamo of South America live in and around the Amazon basin. The Yanomamo and the forest they live in are thought of as untouched, as the last virgin wilderness and people. But really that's a misconception. 400 years ago, slave plantations were set up on the coast to the north and south of the Amazon. They caused a dramatic change here. That deadly mix of measles, smallpox and malaria escaped into the rainforest. And it was particularly malaria which did the damage. Only now are the results of that damage being discovered. Our stereotype of South American rainforest people is of dart-blowing natives, hunter-gatherers from the time their ancestors came down from Alaska. But nothing could be less true.
The civilizations that we find in the archaeological record of this region for about 2,000 years before the European conquest seem very different from the peoples who live there today. In many ways, the history of cultures and peoples in these great Amazonian basins is similar to that of the ancient river basins of the Old World, like the Indus Valley, like the Nile, like Mesopotamia. People started in a very small way, they built up to something very substantial, and they created elaborate societies of highly complex organization and very dense populations. In our excavations this year in Brazil, in Monte Alegre, we seem to have found that these beautiful rock paintings, which anthropologists have really neglected, they appear to have been made by the very earliest Indians that we know of in Amazonia 10,000 years ago. These paintings have never, to my knowledge, appeared in the public eye before.
Other evidence of early Indian activity comes from the artificial mounds along the riverbanks. These are where they built towns of up to 20,000 people.
We saw a whole slew of indigenous societies of great variety and brilliance. Step by step, each of these cultures made great innovations. The earliest pottery in all of the New World was made in the heart of Amazonia. And these were the societies that bit the dust practically within 100 years of the arrival of the Europeans. Decimated by disease, these people disappeared.
Amazon Indians today live very differently from 4 centuries ago. What you see now are people living in what seems to be virgin rainforest. But it's now known that as far back as the time of Jesus, the indigenous peoples were clearing huge areas of jungle to plant maize. The pollen in this soil has shown that crops grew here for 1,500 years. Longer, in fact, than a lot of the present rainforest. Their areas of land cleared for maize fields stretched for up to 40 miles in every direction. In fact, ironically, the destruction of the Indian population by European and African diseases meant that the trees could grow back.
But many things happened to them in this terrible time of conflict and change, and it appears that the conditions of life for Indians became much worse, much less favorable than in ancient times. And you get very strange phenomena such as loss of stature. People become much shorter in many areas than they were in ancient times. When we excavate ancient people, we find that many of them are very tall as the average height in the United States today, for example. So that when we look at the ancient skeletons before the European conquest, we see very little evidence of infectious disease in Amazonia. Very, very little. A few people have some signs in their bones of the lesions that infectious disease cause, but very few people. For the most part, people were tall and strong and well grown.
The Yanomamo may be part of that original culture, or they may be a group who came in from the forest fringe once the early inhabitants had died off. Whatever their beginnings, they've had about 300 years of isolation in the rainforest, more than enough to turn them back into a virgin population. Gold has been found here. The Yanomamo have become part of a wild and destructive Brazilian frontier. The new invaders come and flush away hillsides to find their precious metal. The mercury used to extract the gold is poisoning people and the wild animals which used to provide food. And trees are being ripped down in a rapid and uncontrolled way. Apart from new diseases like measles, it's forced a pace of change on the Yanomamo to which they're finding it hard to adapt. This story may have modern trappings, but it's been the same pattern for the last 500 years since the old world met the new. It's just that this is almost the last time it will happen. One in 5 Yanomamo who come in contact with Europeans die. The survivors are forced to beg. The illness and the humiliation mean they'll lose their identity and almost certainly slowly mingle into the invading crowds and disappear. The human face of the globe has been changed by people's vulnerability. The Yanomamo are clearly in a fragile state, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're invincible. We may think we have modern medicine to protect us, but there are greater forces at work, and they can overwhelm the ability of doctors or vaccines to cope. Icelanders haven't forgotten what measles can do to them, and have amongst the highest rates of immunization in the world. But that won't protect them against new and unexpected pandemics.
Jæja, strákur, það kemur skotið.
The world is in a perilous condition which is dangerous and unpredictable. These children are under the thinning Arctic ozone, thinning caused by distant people, perhaps the vehicle exhaust from a limo in Los Angeles. The extra ultraviolet light may eventually deplete their immune systems, making them susceptible to an ancient disease like leprosy. Most of the world is easily within reach nowadays. Even the remote part of Iceland, which suffered the measles epidemic in 1904, isn't so isolated anymore. The Earth has become less diverse. There are fewer cultures. There are fewer animals and plants. And this lack of diversity means we and our environments are potentially weaker. We share vulnerability across the globe. Now any of us can be the Amerindians of tomorrow, and the cause won't be as much germs as the untoward effects of human activity. There aren't separate disease pools nowadays. The world is small and vastly more interconnected. And we have to care what happens in every corner, because it's now all in our backyard.